In its time, it was the biggest manhunt in British criminal history. For more than 5 years, a serial killer stalked women, some of them prostitutes, in the north of England, in Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, Halifax, and across the Pennines in Manchester, brutally murdering at least 13 of them and attempting to kill 7 more. When the Yorkshire Ripper was finally caught in January 1981, it turned out that Peter William Sutcliffe, a lorry driver from Bradford, had been interviewed by police 9 times during the investigation, but had never made it onto the list of serious suspects. This was a dark period for West Yorkshire Police. Hundreds of officers worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, for months on end, trying to find the killer. The police incident room in Leeds became so overwhelmed with the paperwork that its floor needed reinforcing. Despite the hard work, fatal mistakes were made, not least over the time given to a fake boast from a hoaxer on a cassette tape. But the lessons learned from the Yorkshire Ripper investigation changed British policing forever. Senior officers received better training, new technology was introduced, and detection methods were standardised across the country. It all started in West Yorkshire on the 30th of October 1975.
This is BBC Radio Leeds. Good morning. Police are investigating the discovery of a woman's body on a playing field in the Chapeltown district of Leeds.
Wilma McCann had 4 young children. Her son Richard was 5 years old.
I was woken up the day Mum didn't return by my sister Sonia, who shook me and said, "Richard, Mum's not come home, let's go look for her." And we left the house, wandering the streets looking for her, finally making our way to the local bus stop. And as each bus came and went, we realised that she wasn't going to come home.
3 months later, Emily Jackson was murdered in similar circumstances. Neil Jackson was 17 when he was asked to identify his mother's body. Over the next few months, he couldn't escape the police appeal for witnesses.
Worst thing was walking about, seeing photos of Mum on the walls and buses or whatever. Shocks you, really shocks you.
He'd also discovered that in a desperate bid to save the family business, his mother had been out soliciting the night she died.
We have a picture of a man, early 30s upwards, possibly to mid-50s.
The killer appeared to be stalking red light districts, claiming 2 more victims in early 1977. Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield described the sort of man he was looking for.
A man who has a hatred of women of the streets.
Well, I'm pretty frightened because it can happen to any one of us any night.
Sex workers in Chapeltown were nervous.
You need money, you just take chances.
They are very, very reluctant to come forward indeed.
Police appeals for information fell on deaf ears, as Detective Chief Superintendent Trevor Lapish explained.
Is that members of the public, because it's a prostitute, do not feel affected themselves. Had it been the murder of a young baby or a young girl, then I think we would have had far more people trying to volunteer information.
Even as a young child, Richard McCann felt the disapproval.
One of the things I'll never forget is the feeling that I had that these women, the early victims at least, were looked down upon. I can remember a number of occasions where a neighbour, for example, when I was in the house playing with her son, after it was announced on the TV that another woman had been killed, she tutted and said they deserve all they get, and that really hurt.
Joining me to remember the long investigation to find the killer here in the studio are John Dumail, then Detective Chief Superintendent, later Assistant Chief Constable of West Yorkshire Police and one of the senior investigating officers on the case, Elaine Benson, then Elaine Anderson, a new recruit to the police force who went on to become a detective on the case, Andy Laptew, a junior detective who was involved from the very beginning, Krista Ackroyd, then a local news reporter who followed the Ripper investigation closely, and from Newcastle we're joined by David Zachrison, then a detective inspector with Northumbria Police. Can I ask all of you when you first got involved in this case and roughly where you were when that happened? John Dumail.
Yes, well, I was running the Force PR department and press liaison and that sort of thing. And I went to the McCann scene as I did the Emily Jackson scene and the Irene Richardson scene. So I was involved very much with understanding what the injuries were and everything else.
Andy Laptew, how about you?
I remember it very well because I was on the task force then. And the job of the task force was to do house-to-house inquiries, search the scene, and follow up any inquiries that needed following up.
And David Zachrison, how about you? What was your first involvement?
I was a member of Northumbria Police, and What I knew of the murders in West Yorkshire was simply through circulars, and I suppose what goes through your mind when you have a homicidal maniac is, there but for the grace of God, he's not in our police force. But if there was any way in which we could have helped at that stage, obviously we would.
We'll go on to learn how you were able to help later on, but Krista Ackroyd, you were a cub reporter, I think, at that point, in your teens.
I was 18 years old. I'd just taken up my first job with the Halifax Evening Courier. I was quite disillusioned very quickly that my role as a reporter would be very much a writer of golden weddings and women's issues, and that these kind of stories were left to men to cover.
It was like that then, wasn't it?
There was a crime reporter, and it was his job to do the serious news stories, and as a woman we had to very quickly fight for a position.
Well, it's interesting. I was going to ask Elaine Benson about this, because this was the time, mid-70s, when I think women in the police force were being amalgamated into the general force where the men were. It was all, things were changing.
Oh, we were like the token gesture, really. I was a probationary constable at Batley at the time. When I joined the police, you'd have one woman on each shift. And I wanted to be that one woman in CID. So you had to work really hard.
It was a man's world.
And he lapped you.
In fact, we welcomed police women coming in because it'd be nice to have some glamour around for a change, you know. But I don't think it made any difference to the actual outcome.
It was a very difficult kind of crime to investigate, wasn't it? That the killer seemed to have no connection with the people that he killed.
It was very tricky. This monster used to choose his victims at random by driving round West Yorkshire, Greater Manchester, saw a prospective victim and then did the deed. There was no rhyme, no reason to it.
But he did have a distinctive method, John DeMail.
He did, yes. A tremendously big hammer assault to the head with a knife attack to the body, basically. The populace and the police were all very concerned about these murders.
Was it difficult to get sympathy for the victims because they were prostitutes at first? Was that your impression? Because people talked sometimes about, you know, innocent victims as opposed to people who were prostitutes. I understand what is being said.
And my personal feel with regard to that, it wasn't as much as what is being made out. And I have great sympathy with that bit of our population, the ladies that were involved. They don't go on the streets because they want to. They go on the streets because of economic situations or because of the situation in which they find themselves.
The idea that police looked at prostitutes as being almost complicit through the activities.
You meaning if they wanted to hang around on dark corners, they got what they deserved?
Yes. Even at the time, that was an awful statement to make. Yeah. All human beings are equal. All life is equal.
I'd like to just talk, before we move on, about the immense amount of shoe leather that was worn out by police who had to go from door to door and talk to people. You were nodding, Elaine. You had to do a lot of footwork.
Oh, we did. And on occasions when I had to do it on my own on an evening, sometimes, as we have in West Yorkshire, we've got terraced housing and the address might have been at the back and I'd have to walk up the ginnel, knock on the door in the dark, tell him why I'd come, make arrangements to see his family at some stage to try and eliminate him. It was difficult.
Andy Laptew, you had to do the door knocking as well.
I did loads of door knocking. I mean, an insurmountable number of door knocks. And we had a technique. We used to say to the wife, now's your chance to get rid of your husband if you want, jokingly, just to break the ice.
Hello, love. Hello. We're doing house-to-house inquiries regarding this murder that happened on Saturday night.
On the 26th of June 1977, a 16-year-old shop assistant, Jane Mcdonald, was murdered on her way home from a night out.
Did you know her at all? No, love.
The investigation was by now attracting huge national interest.
Each murder victim has her own chart. This one's for Jane MacDonald, the innocent 16-year-old girl.
5, 10, 15, 20.
In October 1977, there was a promising new line of inquiry, a crisp new £5 note. The note had been found in the handbag of the killer's latest victim, Jean Jordan, across the Pennines in Manchester. and police suspected the prostitute had received it from her last client, who was probably her killer.
Well, the police turned up one day, the detectives, wanting us to help them.
Maureen Banham worked for the Midland Bank in Shipley.
Well, it was quite a big task, really, because obviously we give quite a lot of money out, and trying to trace that one £5 note out of all the thousands of £5 notes that had gone out was quite a thing to do, really.
This is the back of Gerrard's wood yard. It's a quiet area.
At the end of January 1978, Detective Superintendent Dick Holland showed journalists the scene of another murder, this time in Huddersfield.
The body was dragged through here and placed between this pile of wood and this wall.
The victim was 18-year-old Helen Ritker.
How did he kill her?
She had severe head injuries and at the same time mutilations of the body.
The killer was now known as the Yorkshire Ripper. Bernard Falk reported on the story for BBC Television.
This is now the headquarters of Britain's biggest murder hunt. There are 250,000 files here alone. A total of 7 prostitutes and 1 innocent girl of 16 have been found murdered and another woman seriously assaulted.
The body was found here in the grounds of the Manchester Royal Infirmary.
It was May 1978 and the latest victim was 41-year-old Vera Millwood. Tyre marks matching those at previous murders were found at the scene, a vital clue that Manchester detective Jack Ridgway didn't want to reveal to the public.
There are similarities between this murder and the previous murder in Manchester, and there are also similarities with the murders in West Yorkshire. I have got a completely open mind on the subject.
Incident room, please, are you sure?
A team of 12 elite detectives was appointed to review the investigation and to establish which attacks should be attributed to the Ripper.
The purpose of my visit here today is to go right through this series of so-called Ripper assaults and murders.
It was headed by John DeMail.
I shall see if I can find something that has perhaps been overlooked before.
Now, at the press conference, the phrase novel methods of inquiry was used. Could you enlighten us on what that means?
I could, clearly, but I don't wish to.
John DeMail, what were some of the things that you weren't telling the press at the time?
Well, in any murder inquiry, the police keep certain things to themselves. One of the reasons is that people come forward and say they're the person. And by knowing things that was not been given out, we can eliminate them from the inquiry very easily. There was so much information. A lot of facets of the inquiry, like the tyre marks, generated 50,000 inquiries on their own.
The public didn't know about the tyre marks, did they? Because that was a distinctive clue to who the killer might have been.
Yeah, so if I was the murderer, I'd immediately change my tyres. And the same thing with regard to the beard.
Many reports of a killer who was bearded.
Yeah, but there was a great deal of discussion, and that's a kind word to use, between myself and George Oldfield with regard to whether this should be put to the public. And a view on that was that you immediately put it to the public, you shave off his beard, so you then don't know what you're looking for.
Krista Ackroyd.
I was a woman working on the job, walking on the streets, talking to prostitutes. That I was only 19 years old, feeling very vulnerable. I would have liked to know what I was looking for too.
John.
I was asked to review the situation. How many murders or assaults were in this series? This was to help the investigation. It was not to say this is a definitive list of everyone. And there was great pressure on me not to put anyone in there that I was not certain about.
And at that time, I met a woman who was to remain a friend of mine for 30 years, and that was Olive Smelt, who had survived, and at that time had been added to the list.
Was she a prostitute?
Absolutely not, although she lived the rest of her life with people whispering.
She was titled a good time girl, whatever that means.
Well,
she liked to go out and have a good time, basically.
Well, I like to go out and have a good time, Andrew, but that, you know, it does not...
I'm talking patrimony here, again.
Yeah, absolutely. It was horrendous. And the first thing she did to me, she took my hand, I'm 19 years old, she put it at the back of her head, and she said, feel my head. And half of her skull had been caved in. And every week that woman went to her local hairdressers to have her hair rearranged so that nobody would look and see the terrible damage that had been done to her.
Andy, what about the £5 note inquiry?
The £5 note was found on one of the deceased.
And it was new, wasn't it?
It was a new one, recently issued, and it was in a secret compartment of a handbag And we had officers from Greater Manchester teamed up with West Yorkshire officers and went knocking on doors of people that could have been paid out with this particular £5 note, which might lead back to him, which, had the fates been kinder to us, it would have done, but unfortunately not.
Well, it did, didn't it? Because he was interviewed about it.
He was interviewed about it, yeah.
So the investigation was absolutely on the right lines, wasn't it?
It was on the right lines, but it was still a bit nebulous then. You know, it wasn't something you could really pin your hat on.
Elaine?
I was put in the incident room on the Ritka murder, and the paperwork was just vast, absolutely vast. And there were different sections of the incident room where we had, like, prostitutes, then general enquiries, then the statements, and there were different groups of police officers from different areas of the force dealing with all those different aspects.
David Zachrison, we're now entering the area which was of great interest to the police and in the end turned out to be a hoax. There were some letters sent, which you saw, from somebody claiming to be the Ripper.
Yes, Northumbria Police had initially been asked to assist in 1978. 3 letters had been posted with the Sunderland postmark. We were initially informed that the letters contained information that only the killer would know. And in the early stages, we didn't have sight of the full content of the letters.
But of course the extraordinarily, apparently significant finding was the cassette that this person had sent, and you were present at the press conference in Leeds when George Oldfield played it to the press.
Yes, and when it was played, there was almost an audible gasp, and we knew then that this would generate a tremendous number of inquiries.
I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George. They can't be much good, can they? I'm not quite sure when I'll strike again, but it will be definitely sometime this year. At the rate I'm going, I should be in the book of records. I think it's 11 up to now, isn't it? Well, it's been nice chatting to you, George. Yours, Jack the Ripper.
In my own mind, I'm satisfied as I can be that this is the man we're seeking. If my belief is right that this chappie is living down here in Yorkshire or Lancashire, then he should stick out like a sore thumb with that accident.
Less than 3 months after the tape was broadcast, the killer struck again.
Police in West Yorkshire have confirmed that the 20-year-old Bradford student was the 12th victim of the so-called Yorkshire Ripper. Barbara Janine Leach was last seen early on Sunday morning after having drinks with friends.
Posters on 6,000 hoardings nationwide will, hope the police, familiarise everyone with the Ripper's handwriting. £1 million worth of advertising space and local radio airtime had been donated by the time the campaign got underway today.
The Yorkshire Ripper. How can we stop this madman from killing again?
The political pressure to solve the crime was now immense. The Home Secretary, William Whitelaw, paid a visit to the incident room, and 2 senior detectives arrived from Scotland Yard.
Commander Neville arrived in Yorkshire with, as he said, an open-ended return ticket. He and his assistant, Chief Superintendent Joe Bolton, will help the Ripper team for as long as they're needed.
Detective Sergeant Dick Holland warned women not to go out alone at night.
We just do not have enough policemen in West Yorkshire to guard every woman who chooses to go out on her own at night. We've issued strong warnings in that direction, but we are still having brought to our notice girls walking in isolated areas in the dark alone at night.
Angry women protested against what they saw as a curfew on women. Julie Bindle, then a women's rights campaigner in Leeds, was one of those behind the Reclaim the Night movement.
We were damned if we were going to follow advice that police gave us and either ask a man to accompany us, remember that man could well be a sexually violent man himself, or stay in. Why wasn't there a curfew on men? That was far more important in terms of keeping women safe.
Well, there was a lot of pressure from government, from the Home Office, to get a result. Krista Ackroyd.
I think there was pressure from everybody living in the north of England. Lives had changed, Sue. What we had been used to, going to meeting friends, going to the cinema, ended. No woman was safe. This is what we were being told. So there was a feeling of anxiety.
John DeMille.
My eldest daughter lived in Chapeltown, Leeds, where some of these early murders took place. I played ale with her about living there, and she moved to another area of Leeds, and that's where the next murder took place, about 300 yards from where she was living. You know, just appalled I was, but that's the way it was.
And David Zackerson, you were working in Sunderland. What was the work that you concentrated on out there?
Well, several officers were equipped with tape recorders, and they went round to working men's clubs, offices, community halls, and actually played the tape to them. And anybody who came forward with a possible suggestion, details were taken and that individual was interviewed. Voice experts pinpointed the accent to Castletown on the north bank of River Wear, and so we set about eliminating all males within the age group, which was quite a wide spread, on the ability to commit the murders, and secondly, whether or not he was the letter writer.
John DeMille, there was real pressure from above to believe that this is actually the killer on that tape.
It appeared that perhaps he was. Therefore, inquiries had to be made to eliminate him.
But of course an awful lot of police time and money was spent.
But so it was in lots of other directions. There were hundreds and hundreds of hours spent chasing shadows all over.
But we, as members of the public, were now looking for a man with a northeastern accent.
David Zackerson, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, I was worried about these letters. They didn't appear genuine, and I felt that the old-fashioned phraseology could have been copied from elsewhere and knowledge gleaned from newspapers. There was no reference to an MO. There was no specialist knowledge whatsoever. Everything was in the public domain.
And George Oldfield was almost obsessing about the letters and the voice, wasn't he? And it was perhaps he was not seeing the wood for the trees.
Maybe so. There were, well, say I was never keen on this northeast facet of the inquiry. You know, you can tell how much time we spent here talking about it, and it's all extra to the real inquiry.
Krista Ackroyd.
I remember hearing the rumour that Margaret Thatcher herself wanted to come post-haste to help West Yorkshire Police solve this crime, and I think as we know, the Home Secretary Willie Whitelaw did come up. I always felt it was rather naive to think that Scotland Yard could suddenly arrive and solve the crime.
Andy?
Well, Dick Holland, who was known for his wit, said, why should we have the Met Police helping us?
Yeah.
They haven't solved their Ripper case yet.
That's right.
So there was some resentment going on?
Oh, yes, definitely, because we had to clean up our own laundry, really.
Elaine, this meant that your life wasn't your own, you know, when the investigation was at its height.
Yeah, 12-hour days, 6 days a week, 1 day off to do your washing, because one day I got up, I had no clean knickers.
Yeah, but we were all full of machismo. We're hard-faced, no-nonsense, bull-nosed street detectives. Yeah. So we didn't need the rest and relaxation of mere mortals.
John?
Too many working hours in whatever job you are in is counterproductive. But Oldfield and Holland worked more hours than anybody.
We all wanted to catch him, yeah, and we all hoped that it would come. You could see the force was almost crumbling. Yeah. George Oldfield in himself, he was like a broken man. Dick Holland, heart of gold, really wanted to catch him.
Krista Ackroyd.
I'm just reminded as we're sitting here and we're talking about police, I was going into people's homes whose daughters have been lost. I remember going down to the Leaches in Kettering and thinking, this is just like my mum and dad's house. There's the school photographs on the wall. There's the tiled fireplace. There's the Crossley carpet saved up for. And Barbara's father, David, was talking about an outfit that his wife, Barbara's mother, Beryl, had bought for her university daughter's funeral. And this is what he said. I remember when Barbara died, Beryl went out and she bought an outfit for her funeral, and I raised my eyebrows a bit at the price. But as she pointed out, it was not an outfit for her funeral. It was an outfit for her graduation, her wedding day, the christening of her children. Let us never forget that is what Sutcliffe did. He took away lives.
Every officer in West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, I would argue, gave their heart and soul and bones to solving that inquiry.
You interviewed Peter Sutcliffe, didn't you, Andy? What impression did he make on you?
I wasn't happy with Peter Sutcliffe. There were a lot of alarm bells ringing. The reason we actually went to see Sutcliffe was because his vehicle had been sighted in 3 red light areas. He had a striking resemblance to the photo fit of the woman who was attacked in bustling Thorpe Lane at Leeds. He had a gap in his teeth, which again was indicative of the attacker of 2 of the women that were killed. He was in the suspect occupation group, i.e. he was a heavy goods vehicle driver. And I said to my colleague, why don't we bring him in? And he says, no, we've been told specifically, do not bring anybody in. In fact, I'll tell you what happened. I took it directly to Dick Holland, a man who I put on a pedestal, hero worshipped. Has he got a Geordie accent, he said. I says, no, he's local, he's from Bradford. And I says, he's a dead ringer for the photo fit. Then he said, if anybody mentions photo fits to me, again, they'll be doing traffic for the rest of the service. With a few expletives thrown in, which obviously I can't repeat, but I could have crawled under the crack in the door.
As his leg-weary squad of detectives set out on yet another round of inquiries, the Assistant Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, Mr George Oldfield, broke the news to journalists that 20-year-old Jacqueline Hill had become the Ripper's 13th victim.
The death of the Leeds University student on the 17th of November 1980 caused more outrage.
You're not a man, you're a beast.
Relatives of previous victims and survivors of Ripper attacks spoke directly to the killer on Newsnight.
Most men don't have to kill women to prove that they're a man.
You'd be better off killing yourself before someone else does it.
As you can see, it's a vast expanse of spare land.
Police patrols were stepped up, but the public fear was palpable.
You're on the alert all the time. We can't relax really at all. Every minute of the day, as soon as I wake up, that's my first thought. Is he about?
The Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, Mr Ronald Gregory, also announced changes at the head of the team investigating the Ripper murders.
4 senior police officers from other forces and an experienced forensic scientist were drafted in to head the investigation in a shake-up that saw George Oldfield replaced as its leader.
It was partly our idea and it was partly a Home Office suggestion, and I certainly pray that it's going to be of some help.
Then, suddenly, 6 weeks later, came the long-awaited breakthrough. A Bradford lorry driver was picked up by South Yorkshire police officers on a routine patrol in Sheffield.
Good evening. Peter William Sutcliffe, aged 35, from Bradford in Yorkshire, has been remanded in custody for 8 days, charged with murder.
He'd been arrested with a prostitute in a car with stolen number plates, and was later found to have hidden a hammer and a knife at the scene.
Preceded by his wife Sonia and her father, Sutcliffe, covered by a blanket, was then rushed into the court building.
And at last the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper was over.
As he was bustled across the pavement into a waiting police van, the volume of abuse from the crowd rose to a deafening pitch. Peter Sutcliffe worked for a Bradford engineering firm as a long-distance lorry driver. Today, the managing director recalled that along with the rest of the staff, Sutcliffe was interviewed by detectives in connection with the murder of a woman 2 years ago.
We were interviewed, we've all been interviewed. Peter's been interviewed also, and I believe he's been taken in twice to be interviewed more thoroughly in the police station.
Let me ask all of you round the table your reactions to the arrest of Sutcliffe after all these years. What did you feel, Elaine?
I was at a christening party when a relative rang me and told me that he'd been caught. I was absolutely euphoric. It was absolutely wonderful that there wasn't going to be another murder.
David Zachrison, I think you were at a party too when you heard this news.
Yes, it was Sunday
the 4th of January, and Detective Chief Superintendent Clark told me the Ripper had been caught. I was tremendously pleased, and I must admit there was a certain amount of relief when Mr. Clark turned round and said he hasn't got a Wearside accent.
Andy Laptew.
How do you describe a thunderbolt to your heart? The bottom had fallen out of my world. I got in my car, dashed up to the police station, opened my locker door and looked through my notebooks, and there was his name, Peter William Sutcliffe. Not satisfied with this man, full report submitted. I didn't know what to do. Had I done right? Had I done wrong? Is there anything more I could have done? And you tend to blame yourself, because 3 women had died since I submitted that report. Well,
you had said, I'm not satisfied with this man.
Yeah, and suggest that he be seen by a senior officer with a more intimate knowledge of the case.
What happened to that suggestion?
Failed.
So you're giving an impression of an absolute unwillingness of the hierarchy to take your views into account.
Absolutely. I think that's what's turned me into what I would say a rebel without a clue. Anti-authority, if you like. And then the press turned up at my doorstep, 3-inch headlines with quotes, allegedly from me, that weren't true, like the lonely voice crying out in the wilderness against the might of West Yorkshire police, and I'd displayed nothing but loyalty. But yet I was treated like a pariah by all and sundry. People who I thought were friends ignored me. Senior officers made life a little bit difficult for me. Instead of speaking to me, they grunted. I says, it's all right if you want to grunt. I've worked on a pig farm, I know what you're saying. I got really, really upset by all this.
Why were they upset about you?
They try and find a crack in you if you find a crack in them. Not just the police, but any organisation.
John DeMel, obviously Andy's still very angry about this. Do you understand his feelings?
Absolutely. I was gone from the inquiry before what he's talking about happened. I can only say I hear what he says. And good management from the hierarchy means really looking after your team and giving everybody time and listening to everybody. The police cadet might clear it up. So you have to listen to everyone and take aboard what they say. Well, his report was clearly not listened to, and I don't really know by whom. But if it was just went as far as Holland and never went any further, there's your answer.
Krista Ackroyd.
I think for me, just remember going to that court. We've heard the mob outside and feelings were running so high. And we were nervous about seeing this monster that we've been so terrified about for 5 years, that had controlled our lives, that had controlled the lives of police officers and families and women. And this pathetic, weedy individual with a light voice walked up into that dock. And I was so shocked. They asked him his name, and the first thing, you could hear it around the court, he hasn't got a Geordie accent. He's Yorkshire.
And in fact, Peter Sutcliffe did get 20 life sentences, and he's still in prison 35 years later.
It was an extraordinary day in the Old Bailey's imposing Court Number 1, with truly gruesome accounts of Sutcliffe's methods.
Sutcliffe's trial was dominated by questions surrounding his mental health.
He claimed he heard voices, messages from God giving him a mission to kill prostitutes. Yet Sir Michael said that one officer guarding Sutcliffe in prison had heard him tell his wife that he was guilty and expected to get 30 years. If I can get people to believe I'm mad, he told his wife, I'll only get 10 years in a loony bin.
The man who will lead the investigation, Mr. Lawrence Byford,
No sooner had the trial ended than the questions began. The Home Secretary instructed a team of experts led by Lawrence Byford, an Inspector of Constabulary, to find out how Peter Sutcliffe had been able to evade capture for 5.5 years.
It is apparent from the report that there were major errors of judgment by the police.
6 months later, on the 19th of January 1982, the Home Secretary, William Whitelaw, gave Parliament a summary of Lawrence Byford's findings.
With hindsight, it is now clear that if these errors and inefficiencies had not occurred, Sutcliffe would have been identified as a prime suspect sooner than he was.
I still think that Mr. Oldfield and other officers did their very best.
Chief Constable Ronald Gregory defended his staff.
It's so easy to investigate homicide from a position where you know who's done it and look backwards. The super policeman who can make the right decision at the right time hasn't been born yet.
Mr. Sampson's report details a catalogue of police misjudgments and mistakes during the 5-year inquiry.
An internal West Yorkshire inquiry made further criticisms 18 months later.
How detectives ignored early photo-fit descriptions, how attacks were wrongly assessed, and how the whole administration of the inquiry was below standard.
8 years in jail for the man who hoaxed the police in the hunt for the Yorkshire Ripper.
It would be many more years before a clever DNA analysis located the man who'd led the investigation so disastrously astray. The voice on the tape, Wearside Jack.
And this is the moment when John Humble, in the blue sweatshirt, proved he was the man who sent the hoax tape.
Would you read that for us, please, John?
I'm Jack. I say you are still having no luck catching me.
John Humble had been arrested in October 2005 by a team of West Yorkshire detectives. 5 months later, a judge at Leeds Crown Court sentenced him to 8 years in prison for perverting the course of justice.
Why on earth did this man from Sunderland do it? Well, I can tell you in police interviews what he said. He told them he did it because he was unemployed, he was bored, and he had nothing else to do.
Well, David Sackerson, that was a report referring, of course, to John Humble himself. It was DNA was suddenly available, wasn't it, many years after the event?
Yes, I was extremely relieved when I heard that Humble had been arrested, because I knew that in 1987 an inquiry had been launched on the basis that the hoaxer could have been a police officer. In other words, the only person capable of perpetrating this hoax had to have inside knowledge. I received a telephone call from an officer who introduced himself, and it became apparent that it was being tape recorded, and I put the phone down. And I remember turning round to my wife and saying, if they never catch this guy, we know some of the crazy conspiracy theories that abound, they'll have me as being the letter writer. So when Humble was arrested, I breathed a sigh of relief.
Elaine Benson, we heard Chief Constable Gregory pointing out earlier that the super policeman hasn't yet been born. What's your view looking back on what might have been done better? Bearing in mind hindsight is a fine thing.
Well, we had very few women in the force at that time, and unfortunately, because of the way it had been, we hadn't got the experienced female detective police officers who may have had the feminine side covered with the ladies like Olive Smelt.
Krista?
Just the softer touch to go into someone like Olive and say, talk to me again about the accent, would have helped. It would have helped us as women. It would have made us feel safer. It would have been more reflective of society and more reflective of the victims that Sutcliffe was killing.
John?
The one thing constant about policing is it changes all the time. And that is a good thing. And there is no doubt that there were mistakes made in these series of Ripper murders. But I've investigated 60 murders as the lead detective. They are all cleared. In any one of those, if we had this sort of in-depth look at, there have been all sorts of mistakes uncovered, because it is such an imprecise situation.
David Zackerson?
Everybody gave 100% with methods which appear now to be antiquated. I couldn't have imagined DNA, or indeed closed-circuit television, or personal computers, or mobile phones. So I just hope that if anything like this should happen in the future, that he is caught far, far sooner because of the technological advances that we have witnessed.
Andy Laptew, how much does the whole experience of working on this case still remain with you?
There's not a day goes by when Sutcliffe does not appear in my head through one thing or another. Just when I think it's safe to go back in the water, listen to Radio 4, and he's mentioned.
And Elaine, what about you?
Well, it was a big part of my life, but I did go on to be a career detective constable, and I managed to complete my 30-year service. And when I look back, I would never like to see anything like that happen again.
John DeMille, is it with you every day?
No, it's not. It was a very serious situation, and I'm sure you can tell from the tone of this that everybody took it extremely seriously. But whilst this was going on, there were 100 other murders roughly in the Force area, all of which had to be dealt with. And I eventually became Assistant Chief Constable in charge of crime and uniform duties. And all the murders after that were cleared, partly because of experiences in this.
Krista Ackroyd, you have stayed in touch with many of the families. You had close relations with a lot of them.
And I just want to leave you with one thing that Olive Smelt taught me. I'm not looking back. I'm going forward. I'm a survivor. And when it was announced that Sutcliffe would not be eligible for parole, because this was her greatest fear, she looked at the screen. I was doing an interview with her at the time, and she said, "Let that man's name be never mentioned again."
My only thing is that 3 women could have been saved. And my thoughts are with the bereaved, the families of those who lost loved ones. I have not an ounce of sympathy for Sutcliffe.
Krista Ackroyd, John DeMille, Elaine Benson, David Zachrison and Andy Laptew. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.